Ladies and gentlemen, we would now like to move to the next segment of the program, panel discussions. Our first plenary session is entitled Futures Literacy, Preparing for Emergence and Transforming Governance. I now would like to pass the microphone to the moderator of this session, Dr. Susan Vize, who is UNESCO Regional Advisor for Social and Human Sciences in Asia and the Pacific. Dr. Vize, over to you.
Good afternoon and good morning for those of you who are joining from other time zones. It's my honor to follow three such distinguished speakers, and I hope you thoroughly enjoyed that introduction to the Chula's first Futures Literacy Week. And to start with, a warm welcome to Thailand to be part of the UNESCO Futures Literacy Network and family. And we look forward to a long and very fruitful collaboration. It's great to see so many guests. I can't see all of you on Facebook, but I see a number of faces I know from Chula, from other universities, students, and other organizations joining. So thank you so much for joining us today. So I think it's very timely to have a Futures Literacy Week at the moment. And as our introductory speakers in the opening session have just mentioned, the last 2 years have certainly shown us the value of being flexible and the imperative for us to be able to adjust our expectations and deal with futures that are not as linear and predictable as perhaps we thought they were. And futures literacy is one of the things, and as Professor Hichert put it, is part of a toolbox to enable us to innovate and to respond to these kind of challenges. It also shows the great need for us to have transformative governance, to not only deal with new threats, but also to not lose track of what we were already working on and the things that are important to achieving sustainability, because we have to integrate and adapt and deal with those things that are what we foresaw, what we didn't foresee, and link them all together. And this particular session, we're going to be focusing on some of those things. We need to be able to come up with new ways to deal with these complexities and multifaceted situations. So the panel will today examine sustainable development, especially climate change, and what has been happening to progress achievement of sustainable development and how futures literacy could be applied to bring this forward. And I'd like to just introduce our three speakers before we start. So first we're going to have Dr. Hezri Adnan, who is the Executive Director of the Malaysian Institute of Economic Resources. This is a think tank in Malaysia, and Dr. Hezri is a public policy expert with specialty in sustainable development solutions. And he's an expert involved in a lot of international and local efforts, particularly on climate change. And Dr. Hezri will introduce us to some of those elements. He will be followed by Thanyaporn Krichtitayawuth, who is the Executive Director of the Global Compact Network for Thailand. The Global Compact works on ways to align business and the sustainable development goals. Thanyaporn has a strong corporate background with more than 20 years experience in several well-known companies and a passion for innovation, the sustainable development goals and human development. And she will actually be talking about some of the efforts made on behalf of businesses, particularly Thai businesses, to progress the sustainable development goals. And our panel today will be rounded off by Ms. Tanja Hichert, who is a futures and foresight practitioner from the Center of Sustainable Transitions of Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And Tanja is a known futures literacy expert and also part of UNESCO's Futures Literacy Network and has been working with UNESCO for a long time. Stellenbosch is the UNESCO Chair in Complex Systems and Transformative African Futures, and she will be able to talk particularly about contextualizing some of the comments from our speakers in terms of futures and also comparing that to some of the things happening in Africa at the moment. So, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers from the panelists. If you do have questions, please feed them in through the chat and they will come to me and we can deal with them after the sessions. So we are going to run to the original schedule, which will take us a few minutes overtime for this session because we've started about 12 minutes late. So we will apologize for that slight overrun, but we'll try to keep on time as we had planned it. And I guess with that, I would like to invite Dr. Hezri to start us off with the first panelists into session.
Thank you, Dr. Susan Vize, for that generous introduction and also the overview of the session. Greetings of peace, greetings of solidarity. I'm Hezri Adnan from the Malaysian Institute of Economic Research, and it's a pleasure being here with everyone today, my fellow panelists and also the audience virtually. It is, in fact, a very rare occasion to be able to speak, you know, on a topic like this. It's not every day that I get a chance to talk about the future. But let me just start with a couple of slides on particularly the theme of the week itself, you know, on futures literacy. And I would like to commend the organizers for bringing this topic as a focus at Chulalongkorn University, and I hope this will broaden and expand throughout the universities and think tanks and the civil society networks in Southeast Asia, at least. But you know, in the scientific community, there's always been this sort of, you know, a bit discomfort when you talk about the future. Here at the Malaysian Institute of Economic Research, we do look at a short-term future. We have been running the Business Condition Index and Consumer Sentiment Index. It's a quarterly outlook of the economic health for more than 2 decades, actually. And this has been used by many people, many organizations to sort of scan the near future. But if you look at the, you know, from popular culture, the notion of looking at the future is not something very strange. As you know, the famous Nostradamus, for instance, the French healer, seer, has been known to make some pretty, I mean, some say pretty accurate prediction about, for instance, the, you know, the death of King Henry II, the Great Fire of London in 1666, and more recently the rise of Adolf Hitler, for instance, in the last few decades. And closer at home, we have a poet laureate from the Surakarta court or palace in Indonesia, in the Javanese, in Java Island, Ronggo Warsito, who has predicted that Indonesia would reach its golden age around 1945. That's the, you know, when it reached its independence. And he also predicted the rise of someone by the name of Suharto, who became the second president of Indonesia. So it is not very strange. I mean, but again, this is viewed suspiciously by people as, you know, as I don't know, pseudoscience or something even less than that. But it is very important in this day that we live in, where non-linear chain is pretty much the order of the day, to be able to look at the trends. And in the case of Dr. Susan Vize mentioned about climate change, of course, we are now guided by many scenarios, which I mean, scenarios is not a forecast. It's pretty much a possible future development based on certain trends, and each scenario is and one alternative image of the future that may unfold based on certain trajectories of trends. So if you look at the latest IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they outline 5 possible futures up to the year 2100. You know, ranging from the 1.5 degree Celsius temperature increase up to a sort of a more drastic do-nothing fossil fuel development scenario, which, you know, that could lead to about 4.5 degrees Celsius increase. And this would lead the world to different kinds of futures with an S altogether. So these are the kind of things that even you know, the mainstream science is dealing with. We are looking at the trends, and we have to be able to somewhat look at the future more objectively. And in the case of climate change, as we know, if you just zoom in into the food system, the picture is really not that pretty and quite worrying. Here, one of the studies published in, I think it was in the Proceeding of National Academy of Sciences, wheat, rice, maize, soybean, which provide 2/3 of human calorie intake, which each degree Celsius increase in global mean temperature, the average yields of wheat will go down by 6%, rice by 3.2%, maize by 74%, and soybean by 3.1%. And this would have, deep repercussion on the human society. So these are the possible scenarios that, we as human society have to deal with. Now that we are such a powerful geological force, we've reached the age of the Anthropocene. And it's not strange at all, if you read in whatever language newspaper, I don't know whether people still read newspaper these days, but I still do. In whatever language you read, the topic of climate change is always upon us. And, in theory, if you have such inundation of information about the dangers of climate change, we should be able to do more and more, right? I mean, the government would act a certain positive way, and similarly with society. But what we are faced instead is what the sociologist Lord Anthony Giddens said, that the dangers posed by global warming are not tangible, immediate, or visible in the course of day-to-day life. However awesome they appear, many will still sit on their hands and do nothing with a concrete nature about them, yet waiting until they become visible and acute before being stirred to a serious action will, by definition, be too late. So this led to what is known as now the Giddens paradox, and in fact he coined it as Giddens paradox. And this is where we are at now. But having said that, particularly in recent years, in recent years, we're seeing a sort of a serious new emerging trends with regards to our response to climate change in the market side and also on the government side. As we know, Asia is pretty much at the epicenter of the climate change effects. And if you look at the latest assessment, the IPCC assessment, the 6th assessment, they have just released, but they don't allow us to cite as yet, is the Adaptation, Vulnerability and Impact report by the Working Group 2, which points to a very bleak, a very worrying picture about how the world will be impacted by climate change. Particularly, I think in this particular report, they look at the impact of climate change on ecosystems, on biodiversity, and also human communities. And I think as a result of the more violent, if you like, environment that we're seeing in recent years, the response from the market has been, quite encouraging in a way. Companies or firms are rushing to embed climate risk into their risks, into the governance framework, into the business strategies, and so risk management. But that presents a kind of a risk for society. How do you manage greenwashing, for instance? So, and this begs the question of what forms of governance or governance system would be needed for the future. And at the same time, we are also seeing sort of an upgrading of actions by some governments, if not most government, when it comes to their political system. For instance, I always like to quote what the Chinese government in some years back introduced these ecological civilization priority in their policy, and it became a law, if I'm not mistaken, to justify policy decisions on ecological grounds. So 20, 30 years ago, it seems that it's a tough uphill battle to get governments to adopt ecological rationality, alongside of social rationality and social and political rationality. But it is becoming changing now. But at the same time, the world that we live in is becoming more and more dangerous. Communities are living in a more, a hostile environment. But funding for adaptation to climate change is very scarce. In Malaysia, we've been having problem with big floods since November this year, and that even affected the capital or areas adjacent to the capital, Kuala Lumpur. And now as we speak, the eastern side of Peninsula is also inundated. And there's serious damage to lives, to properties. And, we are hearing more 100-year sort of rain or storm event happening. So this notion of non-linear chain is pretty much a reality that we have to grapple with now. So with that as a kind of the reality that we're facing, what kind of social arrangement or contract or social contract should we engage in the near future? I would suggest three forms of actions that need to be, to be the basis for our new forms of governance in the future. One is a more strategic civic engagement. I think this conference, in fact, Chula is taking it as a week of, future structures is an excellent way forward. But I think we have to have a more strategic civic engagement. As we know, civil society tend to work or tend to operate at the locality, they tend to work with community directly, but more often than not, they face problem understanding the broader policy concern, So in fact, if I can quote a case in Malaysia, in the year 2015, myself and another public intellectual, we convened a group of over 40 civil societies to come together under something called the Civil Society Alliance for Sustainable Development Goals. And the group now has sort of morphed into something called the All-Party Parliamentary Group. It also is a formal grouping in the parliament with funding from government, and they're looking at sustainability solutions on the ground. So a group, this was the first time that environment group, human rights group, women's group came together under one umbrella, engaging with the government, engaging with the Parliament House of Malaysia to work with parliamentarians to come forward with solutions on the ground. So this is how sort of disparate or disconnected groups are coming together to engage at a more strategic level. And then at individual, or most of us are academic perhaps in this group. I think we have to be more active in public policy. There's always this notion that to be an activist, you have to be outside of the official government system. But I think more and more people are saying that we have to develop a capacity for policy brokering, policy entrepreneurship, whereby we work within the state system and build a coalition of experts, coalition of civil society leaders and business leaders to promote specific policy issues. And last but not least is the importance of going back to politics. I always maintain that we have to have, at least in Malaysia, a stronger representation of environment or environmental voices in the August House of Parliament. And I think in the past, we've not been able to do much when it comes to, to get buy-in from the politicians, at least in the Malaysian context. But there are now voices that on the ground that as we lead towards the next election in the case of Malaysia, for some of these groups to begin to come together and offer candidates for, to be represented in the August House of Parliament. So Dr. Susan Vize, I would like to just stop there just for my 15 minutes opening. I'm more than happy to take up exchange in the next round. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Hezri. Very interesting, and thank you for introducing ecological rationality. And I think that this is quite an interesting point, because what is, if we apply political rationality as well, what is rational in the short term and the long term might actually be quite different things. And I think this is the kind of thing where different ways of examining the future can potentially help us. Also, I think it's great that you've given us a really good example, a strong example of how civil society is being engaged in Malaysia, which is a really nice lead-in to Thanyaporn, who is going to talk about engaging with business as our next panelist. So over to you, Thanyaporn.
Thank you, everyone. Hi, future leaders. This is a very good connecting opportunity that we would like to share. How could we think about our future and how can we leverage our opportunity together to design the way that we want and the world that we like to live. I'm sharing the presentation deck. Can you see that deck? In the slide, we will go through together about why we need to think for the future and backward a little bit about 22 years ago. The Global Compact have comprised from the business people from the World Economic Forum on that time in Davos to talk about the leadership in the world. It not only depend on the opportunity for the government to take the lead, because it may be a very short term somehow because of government also change every 4 or 5 years. How about the business? Many of the company also stay long, like over 10, 20, even 100 years. Maybe it's a good time to uniting the business together. Then the United Nations initiate the Global Compact to share the value and principle, the way that we could work for the future. Then today, I'm Tanja from Global Compact, Local Network Thailand. I'm the representative of the United Nations Global Compact to share about the perspective of how the private sector we are driving the sustainable development goals and the agenda for the future. You can see that a principle based we need to think first from the people, start from the human rights, labors, environments, and anti-corruption. However, how it link is not easy to say that the business have to work on this, but it depends on the choice that business need to make their own decision about how could they operate with the business operation and their own supply chain, to think about how could they responsible and sustain their own business for long run. So our ambition in Global Compact, we are accelerating the scale and scale up the global collective impact of the business on upholding these 10 principles on that human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption together. But however, the objective is to help the company not only make accountable companies, but also drive the business ecosystem that enable the changes. How much that we could do. As we had now more than 13,000 companies together as a membership and about 3,800 of non-business participants. We are around the world with a local network that we are comprised with about 87 million employees. If we could do the right agenda, we set the right direction for the future, at least at the minimum, we need to move and make some significant progress. How much we could do progress and how much are the gaps? Even before COVID, we also have a survey, and after COVID, we see the significant improvement. Unbelievable that we see the company now taking more serious on the opportunity to take the individual company action. Above 80%, 88% of the companies that are taking already the activity and the action on the responsible of the supply chain to drive on the sustainable development goals. And in average of 80% that they already have policy and practice in place to drive these 4 pillars agenda. And believe it or not, there are another commitments. 86% they are the real commitment of the company that we had seen from their report and from their action that they already have focus for the equitable growth. Let's see where are the progress that we like to do. Like everyone has said, action on the climate change and to prevent the climate change is mandatory. Currently, it's just only 1,500 companies already have lined up and signed up for the business ambition on 1.5 degrees Celsius limitation. We have another 100,000 companies are coming on the pipeline to do so, but they also have not yet signed up for the business ambition. How about for the people and gender equality? Currently, there are about another good numbers of 80% have already embedded on the plan. For example, they have already set up the policy in place with the employee management program on how to promote the Women Empower program. And even they have a lot of good accelerator activities on the senior management level. Another part of environment, we have a guiding on the framework for the companies to set the water target as a methodology to quantify the benefit on the nature-based solution and also convert back how can we generate the water back to the environment. To engage with the new generation, like today, we have a lot of participants. You are young, and even some of us are young at heart. We have the program for the young Sdg Innovators, which is below 30 years old, to drive on the business solution together, which we think that at least we can close some of the gaps. Now, you see how much the gap we are. No matter we are setting the target on the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, but we need another 62 years to close the gap because we are behind the schedule. Mainly like for the target on gender equality, we have above 268 years as a slowly way to close the gap. Even impact from the COVID. I had some data analyzed that after the COVID, we have a lot of people in female that they have lose their job. It's about 13 million female. After COVID, that they have to sacrifice the career because they have to come back home, take care of children because there's school at home. And there are a lot of activity that people, you may have heard about Great Resignation. And a lot of those are women because they need to choose the family care during the COVID and they have no other choice to do so. So they have to be sure that they can also serve their priority for the family, not only for themselves on growing for the employments. To close the gap is not easy. Now we need to scale up and accelerate the activity together. Less than half of our CEOs members on the private sector, they are thinking about setting the target and the ambition together that align with the SDGs. But at least about 53% already have a company globally that already said that they own have a good supply chain that think about the sustainability that has grown the importance since the COVID pandemic. Many of those are SMEs, unbelievable. However, those are the limited finance and the human resources from the SME company to find the way to integrate the practice. We are supporting organization. However, we think that we should enable them to close the gap. Back to the current situation on the study, we think about how could we provide the capacity building. By the United Nations Global Compact, we drive the challenge together by putting the priorities. How about identifying first on which are the area that business could make the impact for the social by not doing CSR, meaning that they need to do the in-process business services that they can outside the effect on the outcome by using the company's value chains to connect together. And at the end, quantifying the social responsible impact. There are a lot of work in Thailand, they call SROI, to measure about the social return of investments and quantifying it. At least once they quantify the impact as a positive or negative, they have to publish and reporting at the platform. So Global Compact, we supporting the way to think about that target and how the way that can we pick up the report and identifying the opportunity for the indicators and using the tools to drive the impact. So where are the world's most pressing challenges? We are focusing in about these 7 areas on the human rights, labor defense work, climate change, anti-corruption, gender equality. And if they don't know what should we do, at least anything that they can pick on the SDG and integrating into the business opportunity, that's also fine. And the last but not least on the governance, just transition or transformational good governance. We also need to have a highly respect people, to have a high integrity and also transparency. Yourself, for the future leader, you can also pick the area that you think that most relevant to your family, your business, and think about how every day you are doing that would able to contribute to the area that we think is benefit for the society like this. So out of these 7 areas, you also feel free to pick on your own interest, but at least these 7 is the world's most pressing challenge already. Next, the way to do it, connecting the dot, no? But we also think of all business sector. Once they already put the priority in place, at least that number, 13,000 companies already have priorities that connected. Why not? Global Compact, we help both company and academic to connect with the industrial expert including the people from the United Nations, like the UNFCCC on the climate change and others. So I will go through quickly about how should we connect and also getting the learning, getting the leading and communicate together. At least we can accelerate the progress, the remaining gaps that we have to close together. To scale up the ambition is not easy, and you can imagine that once we identify the focus area, there are a lot of good opportunities. We have a lot of good program. I will show you in a way of picking opportunity that you may see is important and interesting. Firstly, it's about the event. In the Global Compact, normally we define priority for Asia and the area like Thailand. Believe it or not, we are very good luck about having a partnership with the United Nations agency, which has a regional office in Thailand. So we plan to do a lot of events on engaging for young generation and SME in Thailand to define the direction, whatever business opportunity we think. We stage the sustainability maturity agenda, like driving the country national agenda. Last 2 years, we set up the BCG as agenda, and that very good that our Prime Minister in Thailand adopt the BCG as a direction agenda for this year, 2022. Next, on the connection for the learning. After the event, Thailand level, we also connect with the governments and drive the agenda on adapt the change. For example, the Thailand climate adaptation change. Moving on academy, maybe it's close to many of yours interest now. It's about how can we think about participating, review the learning from others. Academy, we have a networking and the local on-demand training. I will show you the link and also how you could do the on-demand training for your interest for any time. And the best thing that we can do later is about peer learning group. Self-learning is not easy by individual interpretation, but peer learning is also very good on coaching each other to share experience and participate the subject. As a future learning, it is not only learning by the society, but it's learning by the in-depth insight from the people who have like-minded together. That would help you to accelerate the progress of your interest. The program next is Accelerators. This is the name of the programs. A lot of companies also would like to have a deep dive into the subject to set the goals and work together to set the plan. In Thailand, we set up 2 programs on the accelerators. The first is a climate action accelerators. We call climate ambition accelerators program. I will go to the slide later about how can you enroll and also be part of us. However, next is also accelerator for the SDGs. And the last is the policy advocacy and the Think Lab that we think about a small multi-sector group who can shape throughout the leadership together. If you'd like to join us on the next 2 weeks, you can scan the QR code here about the Target Gender Equality Live. Together we connect from our country to around the world to host the event, talk about how can we empower along with the genders in our society and supporting them. There are a lot of guiding that if you like to take a look on the UN Global Compact, you can go to our library and to see your interest on the literature, and we have a recent report out from the real outcome from the business. For example, the one that we have succeed in Thailand about the women empower principle, that we are doing the gap analysis on the gender gaps. And at least after analysis, we have developed the company opportunity to explain to the management and HR people how can they support driving improvement on the HR policy. And there are a lot more on upcoming themes about the facilitated learning groups. If you have time together, maybe later at the Q&A, we can go through the situation about if you like to call the action and the campaign like the climate action. How could we enroll in Thailand and connect with the Jula Future Literacy to exchange about the think tank and the policy development? I may be ending and the highlight about the program that we have on the Business Ambition 1.5, because it's only the area that we could make significant change in Thailand is to link with the government. We are very glad that the government has announced the target for the climate ambition and carbon neutrality by 2050. We think that if we can accelerate that target to the governments, it's a good time that we also accelerate the target to engage all the people in the country to set the ambition and set the science-based target initiative together. You can scan the QR code, and if we can continue discussing in the future, maybe it's a good time that we can connect and toward that. What does it mean for the individual that you can contribute? I'm ending for the slide like now about at the end, once we have the improvement, we need to communicate. And the literacy that you can see, maybe we can publish the data. Around the world, we have about 70,000 reports already on the way to link on the sustainability agenda on our website. Hope that it's going to be a lot of good steps that you can have some good reflection and have a peer experience sharing together. Thank you. If you'd like to connect us, I will leave on the QR code. Availability of our website and also the Facebook that you can connect. Thank you. So back to Sue and the team, please.
Thank you so much, Thanyaporn. And whilst I'm a little bit dismayed that we have to wait 268 years for the economic position of women and men to be more equal, it's really pleasing to know that business is making so many headroads into achieving sustainability. And I think that in terms of futures literacy, this is quite an important step for business taking, because businesses could continue to operate under the status quo and quite possibly be economically successful. But realistically, if they want to think about their future options and making their business kind of future-proof, if I may say that word, they really do need to start thinking about alternative ways and different scenarios under which they can be operating in 10, 20, 30 years' time. Which is a nice lead into our final panelist, Tanja Hichert, who is going to make some commentary on this and take us a little bit more in depth into the futures literacy and how this can be applied in these kind of situations. So over to you, Tanja.
Thank you. Thanks, Sue. I haven't got some pre-prepared slides because I thought it would be important to try and connect some of the threads of what's been spoken about already, and then hopefully fairly quickly move over into the question and answer. So what I'd like to do first of all is just pick up on something that Dr. Hezri mentioned, and he quite rightly identifies the challenges around it, and that is the Anthropocene. And essentially, those of you that haven't heard this terminology yet, it's a new geological epoch or era that we're entering. You know, we've all come, our humanity has developed in the Holocene, and it's been this really friendly climate on planet Earth, and that's enabled us to create this massive system that we have in terms of feeding ourselves, however unsustainable it is, and build these huge cities full of concrete. And it has also enabled many people to lead good lives. Some too good, arguably. But the problem is the dilemma, this immense existential challenge of the Anthropocene, and particularly on the African continent where I come from, is how can one have a decent enough level of human development and a good life within planetary boundaries? And those planetary boundaries then start speaking so deeply towards the sustainability issues and the gaps that Thanyaporn identified. And there are a number of concepts already that are kind of working with this. So one thinks, for example, of the notion of donut economics, where they define sort of social thresholds of what one would like to achieve for human beings to have a good life. And, you know, for example, it's a level of decent nutrition, not over-nutrition. Sanitation in terms of not falling prey to some very easily manageable infectious diseases. Income, you know, what is enoughness? Access to energy, education, critically important. And of course, we had Professor Munterborn place so much emphasis on that. The notions of equality that Thanyaporn also mentioned, and employment. So these are the sort of social thresholds, and many countries on the African continent haven't reached acceptable levels of those yet. In many other countries, particularly in the Western world, they far exceeded. You know, if one thinks in terms of levels of incomes, for example, people have way much more money than they would ever need in their lives. Of course, that's a subjective thing. Regardless, the point is that we need to be able to get some of these social thresholds reached within the sort of biophysical boundaries of the planet. And these planetary boundaries, I think we all sort of instinctively know them. The big one we're all talking about at the moment is CO2 emissions, but then also there's phosphorus, there's nitrogen, you know, the amount of that stuff we use just to produce food. There's clean water, land use change, ecological footprint. I mean, literally, the fact that we as humans are so deeply dependent on socio-ecological systems that keep us alive. And we're busy destroying them at a rate of knots, you know, if one thinks in terms of biodiversity challenges. So those notions have been brought in very successfully already into the conversation. And the point is now, so what? And I would like to touch on governance. And this is meant broadly. So it's not just governance for governments, national governments. It's also global governance. One would think governance in terms of companies, businesses, governance, civil society, you know, how we govern ourselves. Because essentially it's a system of principles and related rules of implementation. So principles and then how you implement them, that societies use to manage themselves in order to deliver the public goods that it wants or that it thinks it needs. So that's very broad, but the point is that is not fit for purpose anymore. And then we begin to introduce this notion of anticipatory governance and futures literacy. And literally it is about building the capability to not only work with futures to be able to be better able to manage and make choices and decisions in the present. It's also the ability to adapt to and to help shape uncertain futures. So it's the ability to govern for emergence, because we don't know. We're unable to predict, we don't know. And particularly now in this time of sort of these extreme shocks that we're seeing. And do keep in mind that many of these shocks are actually predictable surprises. COVID falls squarely into that category as a predictable surprise. But the point is that this anticipatory governance notion and being better prepared for uncertain futures means we should be able to more effectively address complex problems and understand that complexity is a given and that we need ways of working with it. So we need new tools and instruments. We need new rules and norms that provide a way to use foresight and networks and feedback. And I'm going to just end off with a couple of principles that in terms of how one goes about this, because it boils down to responding to events at an earlier rather than later stage. And this requires flexible decision-making and a flexible decision framework. So, you know, that needs to be institutionalized, essentially to be able to work with a wide range of possible futures so that one is better prepared for change. So I'm just going to end up with some of these principles. One of them, remember this is broadly in governance, is to be able to integrate foresight into policy and decision-making. Another one is to practice long-termism. You know, we are being bombarded by short-term change and disaster and unexpected events, but we need to be able to practice long-termism. We need to be able to incorporate a complex systems perspective. You know, that world of linear rationality and rules and hierarchies and buttons and levers that you can push to be able to get things done, that it really, really does not exist. Harnessing collective intelligence and getting views different from your own is critical. And then when it comes to how we use technology, think about technology and not just technology in terms of ICT, but also data and how we go to work with it. Networked governance and this distributed capabilities is extremely important, because that starts speaking to resilience. You know, resilience, if you've got, you know, one plan in the pot and disaster hits, it's not going to be very resilient. If you have many different perspectives, many ways of approaching something, and the old saying, some fat in the system in terms of different ways of working, you're much better off in terms of resilience. Resilience, by the way, also refers to being able to not just adapt, but also innovate in the face of transformative change. And then finally, adaptive learning. That's swinging right back to Professor Muntabon's extremely important points about the importance of learning and futures literacy falling squarely into that slot. So that's it from me. So I hope I've won us a little bit of time so we can go to Q&A. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, and particularly for bringing up those key principles, because I think that I particularly like the one about long-termism, because, you know, this is part of, I think, the issue, whether we're in the United Nations, we're in national governments, we're in civil society organizations, we're often actually planning for 2 to 3 year cycles. And, you know, how does the future really come into that? Because, you know, I know from myself in UNESCO, we've been planning the same things for the last 15 years, essentially, and we haven't really changed in any way to adapt to that. So I really like this approach to setting out some of these key principles, and that's a great way to look at the speakers before you as well. So again, I won't take too much time in summing up. I think the focus now on how do we use these tools for making life better for everybody, making, you know, this distributed across society and not just pockets where there's wealth. And Dr. Hezri also touched on this, bringing in the vulnerable in terms of climate change. And how do we actually do that within those biophysical boundaries that we do have, with maybe a little bit of leeway for technological advancements? They're definitely there. So it's now the opportunity for all of you listening to share questions with us, to the speakers. And I'd like to start off with the first question that we've received in the chat, which is directed to Dr. Hezri. Sorry, I just have to open it again, it vanished. Could you tell us more about your thoughts regarding strategic engagement of civil society, and with respect to your experiences with the Alliance of 40 civil society organizations in Malaysia to make our transitions possible? What can we learn from your experience in other countries? So over to you, Dr. Hezri.
Thank you, Susan, for that offer to answer a very difficult question, actually. But from our experience, this was a direct response to the 2015 meeting in New York, where you know, head of states agreed to embrace 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And we, I mean, myself, I'm predominantly from the environment sector, and a colleague of mine from the social policy side. We decided to bring the groups, the different groups together, our own networks, different networks together, because the goals, they cut across, and this present an opportunity to bring everyone to the fore. So this was 2015. And, you know, it was quite a journey whereby, you know, it's not easy to bring a women's group to talk together, to human rights groups and environment group. You know, how do you manage that? I guess it boils down to the question of leadership, and I think listening is very important. How do you, you know, how do you get people? If I could quote the term altitude leadership, whereby you look at 50,000 feet, you know, and 5,000 feet, and also 5 feet. Sorry, 50,000 feet, 50 feet, and 5 feet elevation, whereby you combine this macro perspective with something on the ground, and also at the level of self. You know, so you should be driven by those values that you hold dear, and try to get everyone to sort of buy into that process. So the journey started with getting the different groups together, persuading them to talk to each other, trying to manage the different views, different personalities, even to accommodate each other's views. And then once that is already established, then to begin to link them up with the formal processes in government. And that also depends a lot on the structure of civil society and government. I guess it differs a lot from country to country. In the case of Malaysia, it is very, if you like, government, I mean, in the past, they're not too keen on listening to civil society. So that was a challenge in itself, to want to organize the different groups, 40 over groups together, and then to manage them when they interact with the government, so that there won't be, the government side will not be, it will still be interested to engage. And I think the process was managed gradually, incrementally, with a lot of listening, with a lot of persuasion coming in the way, and eventually to try and, I mean, there was also a change of government in Malaysia in 2018. So that opened up a policy window for new ways of doing things. And that was the point where we managed to get the Parliament House of Malaysia, the Speaker of Parliament, to be open to this idea of bringing this group as one of the APP-GM, the All-Party Parliamentary Group, as a formal process. And again, that, once that was established, the groups gets bigger, and there's allocation, and managing that was a challenge. But I think, yeah, I mean, it's a question of leadership, and also, I mean, my colleague was the one who's been driving this more than I do. So I think it depends a lot on his personality as well. So, and there is no silver bullet. In the case of Malaysia, we needed that kind of setup, but I think it varies elsewhere. But whatever it is, I think the key is to get people to be able to zoom in and zoom out, and that's very important, I think. I don't know whether I answer your question there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm sure that you have more opportunities to engage with Michiko, who asked the question at a later date. I'd like to now ask Thanyaporn if she could perhaps elaborate a little bit on how businesses might be prepared to take on the multiple sustainability challenges simultaneously, because Tanja talked about us being able to deal with complex systems perspectives, and I guess one of the things that is quite difficult in terms of transforming governance is how do we actually take on these multiple challenges at the same time? So Thanyaporn?
Yeah, thank you so much. On the challenges, as we are aware, we need to prioritize. If we target everything, we will do nothing. See, like we are fighting for everything. Now, if we think about just the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are interconnected, right? It's a very meaningful action that if we need to pick the most important problem, for example, on the climate change, linked to everyone that have a very connecting together now today about how can we transition into a greener economy that are sustainable. However, it's a goal that we think about. If we are greener, how should we interact with the zero hunger? If we think about that clean economy that help the gender equality and also responsible production and consumption. Now we need to narrative that at the principle of leave no one behind. I know it's not easy to say, and it's not easy to develop the plan, but we need to add the emergency with the private sector that they are not alone. Once we have that discuss and expect that economic transformation that need to enable the ecosystem with the governments. So we have a very good buy-in from the civil society because they are part of the solution. As a major step in Thailand, we are further integrating of those environment and social governance factor into our investments, like the stock exchange. Currently, the stock exchange of Thailand, they are member of the Sustainable Stock Exchange, that they have developed the market for alternative investments to include into the investor in Thai listed company to reflecting the growth on the demand for the investor to support the climate change. As a new rule that we have agreed on COP26 for the carbon market further incentivize and have a very supportive on good investing on innovation to reduce the emission. But these are the very good example. If we like to target one agenda, but we can multiple impact positives to the society. In Thailand, we consider that at least if we think about setting up the country national agenda on the zero emission by 2050. Now, the glide path of the reduction of the emission also help the society to have a greener and better health. So I think it's going to be an example of articulating how the business, we try to find multiple of the solution, but at least we could narrative, at least a storytelling in a one story, and everyone could engage in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And of course, breaking down complex challenges can always help, but not losing sight of them. We also have a question in the chat for Tanja. There is so much suffering in the short term, and for many people trying to survive the short term soaks up all their resources. There's simply no time or energy or inclination to think long term, even though the long term is important. How do you reconcile these seemingly conflicting imperatives?
Thank you for that question. And I can see Adrian's got his camera on there, so nice. I guess by reframing the question and kind of really interrogating how one looks at this, because what is really interesting is that, and remember, enormous amount of systems and institutions and communities on the African continent in particular are informal. Sort of these systems don't necessarily have formal rules of engagement or governance by which they would take decisions, whether they be short-term or long-term. But what is interesting is that these communities or people that are literally suffering, you know, just to make ends meet or going hungry or whatever, most often are traditional societies left behind, poorer, vulnerable members of society, often in some countries, indigenous minorities, that sort of thing. What is interesting is that if one takes their perspective or actively sort of brings in those perspectives and listens carefully, there are enormous amounts of resilience, of being able to get by, of coping, that we can learn so much from. And also ways of thinking about the future and the past. I mean, you know, in the African continent, the importance of the role of ancestors, and the importance of living more, what is the word I'm looking for, in a more complementary way with the ecosystem services that we rely on. That all exists, but it's just never valued, it's never brought into the kind of more formal decision making that we value and that we think is the right way to do things going into the future. So again, you know, this speaks to the principles of harnessing of anticipatory governance, of harnessing collective intelligence, being much more open to different ways of being and doing and seeing and deciding, because those systems are there, and especially with people that don't fit or have fallen through the cracks of our sort of way of doing things. And I don't want to take too long in the answer, but we've actually done some amazing academic work on this at the Center for Sustainability Transitions, where we've been identifying weak signals, and we call them seeds, and they're pockets of the future in the present, literally of how it is possible for people to ascertain, get a good level of human development within planetary boundaries. And we've got a database of these seeds. It's new ways of thinking, it's small-scale experimental projects, it's initiatives, often at community level, or it could be, you know, sometimes it's technology, or new frameworks, different frameworks for understanding the world. And the point is that many of these seeds come out of these poorest, suffering, vulnerable communities. So there's really something there to learn from in terms of how we proceed forward at a sort of a more global level.
Thank you, Tanya. And I think that's very enriching to get these kind of examples and not just to talk theoretically. So thank you for adding that. We still have a few minutes left to take questions. So please do put your question in the chat. And that being said, we have another question for Thanyaporn. Is there a gap between big and small enterprises in pursuing greener economy? And does inclusiveness really work in practice?
Yeah, thank you. This is very important, and we know there are the very good big gaps, and now it's also turned to be opportunity how to be inclusive. So we are thinking about the smaller enterprise. For example, in Thailand, we call it SME, similar to around the world, the business particular SME. There are those hard hit by the pandemic, and will need the structural support to transform their own operation, right? The SME are in Thailand at the backbone of economy and also the largest employers in the country, touching essentially on the every area of economy in Thailand and supply chain. We know that we are not yet able to engage most of the SME to often talk about the way to close the gap, because they may not really need to do it by their own. However, this is a really problem and missing the middle, that they are underserved by the financial institute and no technical assistance in Thailand. So back to the situation that we think about the ability to reduce the emission, mitigate the environment impact on their operation. This is a major dominant of Thailand progress. How to close the gap and how to step up to support them. Currently, at the first step, we have to try and understand on where they are, meaning that where are their operation area that they can touch on the problem. And now on the SME landscape, we know we already have identified who are the winner and who are the loser. You can think about the K-shaped economy that right now. We already have a big gap on supporting. So we are partnering with the Ministry of Industry. We are partnering with the Federation of the Thai Industry, and also a partner with the United Nations Thailand Country Team to structural support, the policy incentive and technical advice. How can we provide the technical support and exchange the idea to transition the SME in Thailand, which is a potential loser already. Currently, we maintain the discussion on the green economy job. How about can we include them into continue growing on the job hiring? The specific project that we had done is about upskill and reskill the training of the SMEs. Individual SME doesn't mean individual people, right? But we need to pick and adopt many of the companies to go together on the circular economy design, on the BCG concept of the bio-circular and green economy job hiring. So now we have a new policy to develop like circular trademark and adopt the company on their new business model. So these are directly engaged to the SME. And finally, financial support. Now we are partnering with the SME sponsorship organization to support providing the employment opportunity to the workers, and so also the money for those innovation and initiative on the green economy. Hope that it also helps some ideas what we are doing on SME, but we also foresee that we never able to close all the gaps, but at least you try best to partner with the governors, and also we try best to support on specific concern area.
Okay, thank you. You seem to be generating a lot of questions, Thanyaporn, because we have another one for you, and I just cannot control my computer to scroll up to it. Let me see if that helps. Okay, I've got it here. So, no, I haven't got it there. So for some reason, my computer will not go up in the chat. So if somebody else could read out the question, Thanyaporn, can you still see the question?
Which one?
The second question that came after the one from Chantana.
Okay.
Is that about to engage the business as active?
Yes.
Actual activities.
Yes. Could you just read the question so that the people on Facebook can also see the question?
Oh, okay. So the question is about how can we engage the business as active in the actual activities not just sponsor or accepting, applying some of the UN principle only. So now in Thailand, we are not talking about that in the context of the business, but we are doing the projects. For example, back to the concept of circular economy on upskill. Upskill meaning that we help the company to review back on their value chain and their own business about how can they reduce the emission and reduce the business opportunity loss due to the climate change. So there are the projects that we are doing, partnering with the Ministry of Higher Education. So there are a lot of good examples. Currently, we have finished about 50 companies complete their project on identifying the new business model. So at least we hope that with the transition to the greener economy, those might be a good role model for the small SME and some of the partnership of the companies that they already changed their product design and backward to review about if they could deliver better on the new product design that would help service to the environment rather than only driving on their profit. Now we think to balance back to the economic that if there are small company like the hostel, we have just trained yesterday 10 of the hospitality business. So we back that not only drive on ecological business on the tourism business, but how can we rethink how to design their services that they have positive impact to the environment. So these are the programs that we are doing together with the Higher Education Ministry.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I've now closed the questions, but I have one last one. To bring it back to futures in particular, a lot of the questions have been focusing on complexity and how we actually deal with this complexity of, getting people to commit, multiple agendas, etc. So Tanja, what kind of futures tools can we potentially apply to deal with some of these issues like complexity?
Gosh, Sue, $1 million question. There's a whole range of them. And this is a really important point, because often, there's a sort of a tool determinism. If you've got a tool, or that thing of if I've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That's not how it's supposed to work with these ranges of tools and methodology. So there's an enormous amount of really good work out at the moment in terms of books, chapters, toolkits, things like that, that are a lot more easy to find than they used to be previously. A good Google good Google search will put you on your way. But just to mention some examples, for example, some work we were doing with the government of Botswana. Lord knows they're wanting to explore for oil and gas in the Okavango Basin. Those of you that don't know, the Okavango is this immense wetland in the middle of the Kalahari Desert. Now, there's wanting to oil and gas drilling. Anyway, shudder. So for that, a futures wheel is a particularly good tool. So we took a whole group of Botswana government decision maker type people through a futures wheel, which is where we had them imagine that a shock and disaster had happened in the future. And this is that there's a major oil spill in the Okavango Delta. And the futures wheel asks, what if, so that you can start getting a handle on these expanding waves of change and consequences, impacts of something. And usually that's done with trend work or sometimes even weak signals. Here we did it with an imaginary shock. And it's a simple, brilliant, intuitive tool to let people have a structured, systematic conversation about the future. And it's super effective. Another tool or method is the one that I mentioned quickly in response to Adrian's question, which is, identify pockets of the future in the present and pretend that they are mainstream. What does that change? What does that then enable you to look at slightly differently, to make decisions? Well, what do we do to help these seeds of change grow and become more mature? What has to change in the system? And for that, one would use a 3 horizons framework. That's become a very now more mainstream, popular way of working. It's fantastic. You work with an imaginary preferred future in the third horizon that doesn't exist, but you have a good idea of what's in the first horizon, what needs to change, what needs to decline, what needs to grow. And then the conversation, again, a systematic, structured conversation, rigorous. What has to happen in that in-between zone? So it's at its essence, it's about transition and transformative change. And that's where the sort of the magic in terms of the application of these tools and methods. That's where the application, and then of course everybody knows about scenarios, but there's a lot more to it than scenarios. And yes, there is a lot of really amazing applied work happening out there. As I said, a good search would do it. And get in touch with a practitioner in your local area. There are many of them.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to allow one more question just because it's Professor Surachai. Because Professor Surachai is one of the people that I guess helped to make Futures Literacy a thing at Chulalongkorn. So that's great. And this is also to Tanja. What could be the next strategy for dialogue and exchange across our national borders and continents? Okay.
To be honest, I think the architecture for that exists already, because if I'm not mistaken, I hope I'm not, I think Chulalongkorn University and Stellenbosch University already have an agreement with one another. In essence, Stellenbosch is the Chulalongkorn of South Africa. We're connected via the UNESCO Futures Literacy Network, and in the audience is a really good friend and colleague of mine, Apewat Ratanawaraha. So, what up to now I think has been sort of smaller, maybe less formal connections, but they're absolutely, definitely there. It's, I think, about putting heads together and maybe formalizing and perhaps being a little bit more ambitious in terms of what is it that we can do in terms of mutual learnings, mutual support, and mutual sharings.
Thank you so much. And we're trying to keep on to time now, so we did save a little bit of time, and that's great. And thank you, Professor Vitit. We see your warm greetings and wishing you and wishes to us all. And thank you for joining us during this session. It's greatly appreciated. So I'm going to go back to the speakers now for just a couple of minutes of closing remarks each, and that will be the end of our session. So Dr. Hezri, can we start with you? You are on mute.
Thank you for that opportunity. Once again, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting the Malaysian Institute of Economic Research. The Futures Literacy is a great program. I think one perhaps concrete initiative is to get future leaders of, at least in this region, in Southeast Asia, to come and talk together and envision the kind of future that they, they would, that they see from their own lenses. And I think this can be done at various levels of different groups, perhaps student leadership, perhaps community leadership involving those below the age of 30 or 40, and for some forms of support to sort of, get them together for a longer period and for them to stay in touch in the forthcoming years. I think that would be a great way to just not envision the future together, but also to work together towards that future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And next to Thanyaporn.
Thank you, Sue, and everyone. This is a very good time together to think about for the future. And we know this is a challenge transition for everyone, particularly the context of the pandemic recovery. It's also inevitable and essential that Thailand, we are together represent the private sector to stay ahead of the curve, that we view the climate change is a problem that we need to tackle together. And emission reduction like PM 2.5 and others, they are the area that if we need to align, we need to get the good example by the government and partnership with the private sectors to do to take the action together on the sustainable investment as an optional cost burden is something that we can no longer afford. But however, we need to really turn around the situation. So at the first step, currently we are acknowledging the way that we have been producing and consuming things that they are no longer sustainable. If we are able to realize, and we need to think for the future, we now think about the rationalize as already translating into the commitment to change that need to get the support and partnership together through the implementation. And now for the private sector, this is a transformation time. It's both for the social responsibility and also the opportunity for sustainable business together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I guess it's really great to actually be able to hear so much from the business sector, because I know for myself that often we don't hear a lot about what's happening in business. So it was really good to have your input today. Final concluding remarks from Tanja.
Thank you. I want to echo something Thanyaporn has just said, and that is, I think, not just is it the time, there's also a great opportunity for doing, for literally now, because of the systemic shock we've had, are still having with COVID, and the other systemic shocks that we know are heading our way. It's a time now for and it's not just about being bold and actually doing things differently and redesigning and reinventing. It literally is a time for working differently, sets of small experiments, and just make complexity and uncertainty your friend, for want of a better expression, and just start doing, because there's a great amount of change in the system. And it requires even greater change from us to be able to create, it's a bit of a cliche, a better world for all. And that includes non-humans. Thank you, I'm done.
Okay, so thank you to all of the speakers. And I think this has been a very practical session, because when I first started doing Futures Literacy, it seemed quite foreign to me. And I have to say, I really encourage those of you that may see it that way to participate in one of these activities like the Futures Wheel, because it is actually very practical and hands-on. And, some of the things it helps you to deal with are things like your own preconceptions and thinking about the future very linearly and as something that is quite set in stone, when in fact, something like the IPPC scenarios that Dr. Hezri showed us, we don't know which future we're going to have. And if we get locked into our preconceptions, we're potentially ignoring the opportunities to better address sustainability and all of these challenges that we have. And as we started off with Professor Hichert in the first session, flexibility, openness, empathy, and being able to apply all of these key things, I think is really critical. So please join me in thanking Dr. Hezri, Thanyaporn, and Tanja from Stellenbosch for today's session. And we will work on sharing the presentations. I see that's in the chat, and we hope you can continue to join the other sessions of the conference as we proceed through the rest of Chula's Futures Literacy Week. So thank you to everybody.